Eleanor Vance had never felt so small in her own home, a sprawling Chicago penthouse where floor-to-ceiling windows frame the city lights like a cold,
Daddy.
glittering tapestry. But tonight wasn't about the view. It was about Leo, her sweet, imaginative 8-year-old who'd spent the afternoon meticulously building a Lego castle he planned to show his father. She'd orchestrated the perfect quiet birthday, his favorite homemade pizza, and a superhero-themed cake waiting on the counter. When Leo blew out his 8 candles in one determined puff, Eleanor felt a fragile moment of peace, believing for a second she could shield him from disappointment. "Mom, is Dad's investor call almost done?" Leo asked, his fork hovering over the cake. Eleanor's smile felt brittle. "I hope so, sweetie. It's a very important one." Important. That was the word Julian had used in his text hours ago. A sterile, corporate excuse that landed without warmth or regret. No apology. No mention of his son turning 8. Eleanor pushed the familiar ache away. "Go on," she urged gently. "You can have the first slice." Leo's face brightened. One wish, one flicker of childhood joy. As the last candle's smoke curled into the air, Eleanor's phone chimed with a notification from their shared cloud account. New album created, St. Bart's Getaway. Confused, she tapped it open, and her breath caught in her throat. Julian Vance stood on a sun-drenched beach, his arm wrapped tightly around a stunning young woman. But it wasn't the woman that made Eleanor's world tilt. It was the caption Julian had written beneath a photo of them kissing. Our future. The penthouse didn't get quieter, but Eleanor's mind did. A roaring silence filled her ears as she scrolled through dozens of photos, each one a dagger. The woman was Chloe, a designer from his office. Leo glanced over, his eyes widening with innocent curiosity. "Mom, who is Dad with?" Eleanor's throat closed as she saw Julian's smiling face on the screen. A smile she hadn't seen directed at her in years. And that was when the life she thought she had shattered into a million pieces. Eleanor Vance had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who snooped through her husband's digital life. For most of their marriage, she had prided herself on trust, on believing that their foundation was stronger than the temptations that came with Julian's immense wealth and power in Chicago's tech scene. A world she had helped build, one she used to be an integral part of before she traded her art gallery career for motherhood and managing their pristine, empty home. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about trust. Tonight was Leo's 8th birthday, and Julian's absence felt heavier than ever, a deliberate choice she could no longer ignore. She remembered late nights alone, scrolling through his company's social media for a glimpse of him at some gala. She remembered canceling her own plans, again and again, because he might come home early. She remembered telling Leo just last week, "Daddy's working so hard to give us everything, honey." Leo had nodded, his little face filled with a solemn understanding that broke her heart. From that moment, Eleanor knew she had to stop making excuses, for both their sakes. After tucking Leo into bed, the cloud notification had been an accident, a careless sync from his phone to their shared family tablet. A mistake. His first real mistake in a long time. Eleanor clutched the tablet, her knuckles white. She felt out of place in her own living room, surrounded by minimalist furniture and expensive art he had chosen. But when she saw a photo of Chloe wearing the Cartier bracelet Julian had claimed was a corporate gift, every feeling of inadequacy turned to ice-cold certainty. "This was for you," he'd said about their life. "Everything is for you." He didn't tell her that everything had a price. He didn't tell her that while she was scheduling pediatrician appointments, he was booking romantic getaways. He didn't tell her how hard he was working to build a second life, one where she and their son were nothing more than a footnote. For a brief moment, as she stared at the city lights, she let herself believe it was a nightmare. She had no idea the truth was far more brutal than she could have ever conceived. There was a time when Julian Vance wasn't a phantom in his own home. Before the endless board meetings, before the hushed phone calls he took on the balcony, before the emotional distance that had become their new normal, he was the man Eleanor had mapped her future with. In the early days, when his company was just a dream sketched on a napkin, Julian would bring her coffee in bed, and they'd talk for hours. He used to hoist Leo onto his shoulders at the Lincoln Park Zoo, doing a terrible impression of a roaring lion. He used to promise, "Ellie, we're a team. We'll build this empire together." And Eleanor had poured her soul into that promise. But as his net worth grew, his empathy withered. It began subtly. A forgotten anniversary, a condescending tone when she discussed her day, a new obsession with his physical appearance. Then came the private trainer, the wardrobe overhaul, and the way he angled his phone away from her any time a text came through. Eleanor had tried to rationalize the changes, convincing herself he was under pressure, that success was isolating. But deep down, she felt herself being edited out of his life. He began to critique her choices, the unambitious friends she kept, her lack of interest in networking, how she didn't grasp the complexities of his world. And Eleanor, pregnant with their second child, absorbed each criticism in silence, the way a woman who feels trapped often does, until she forgot what it felt like to be seen as an equal. What hurt more than the neglect was the gaslighting. Julian had a talent for making his failings her fault. If she felt lonely, he'd say, "You need to find a hobby, Ellie." If she mentioned Leo missed him, he'd reply with a sigh, "Do you have any idea how hard I work to provide this life for you?" But the truth was simpler, colder, and staring back at her from the glowing screen of the tablet. Julian wasn't just working, he was rebuilding. He wasn't just distant, he had already left. And as she watched a short video clip of him laughing with Chloe on that beach, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not grief, not rage, but a terrifying clarity. Tonight, the lies had finally run out of room to hide. Leo Vance had always been a child who saw the best in people, especially his father. At 8 years old, he still believed that every canceled plan had a heroic reason behind it. That every rushed goodbye was just a prelude to a better hello, and that his dad, no matter how rarely he saw him, loved him more than anything in the world. Eleanor wished she could keep that belief intact for just a little longer. That morning, Leo had woken her up by gently placing his hand-drawn birthday card on her pillow. "Mom, do you think Dad will be surprised I remembered his favorite superhero?" he whispered, his face glowing with pride. Eleanor's heart ached. "He's going to love it, honey." His backpack for school was filled with his most prized possessions to show his friends. A polished rock from their last family trip, a year ago, a photo of him and Julian at a baseball game, and the new comic book he hoped his dad would read with him later. At breakfast, Leo outlined his plan for the evening. "After cake, Dad and I can finish my new Lego set." She didn't have the heart to tell him Julian had already texted. She couldn't bring herself to break his spirit. "That sounds like a perfect plan," was all she could manage, which wasn't a lie. It was a perfect plan, a fantasy. The rest of the day, Leo was a bundle of contained energy. He called her from school during his lunch break, asking, "Did Dad send any messages?" By the time they were home, he had set a place for Julian at the table, complete with a napkin folded into a clumsy boat. The penthouse, the city view, the expensive cake, none of it mattered to him as much as the empty chair. "Mom, maybe his meeting is just running really, really late," he said, his voice small. Eleanor wished she could have stopped time right there. But when the cloud notification appeared and Eleanor's face fell, Leo saw it. He didn't see the photos, but he saw the shift in her. His shoulders slumped, his bright eyes clouded over, with a question he was too scared to ask. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper, but she heard everything inside it. It was the sound of a little boy's faith beginning to crack. And as Leo quietly pushed his plate away, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. Tonight, she wasn't just discovering her husband's affair. She was watching her son learn the devastating lesson that sometimes love isn't enough to make someone stay. Julian Vance hadn't just missed Leo's birthday. He had traded it for a new life. As if his son were a line item he could simply delete from the budget. The moment that truth began to crystallize was hours before the photos, when her phone lit up with the message she'd learned to expect. Investor call went long, pulling an all-nighter to close the deal. Don't wait up. No. Happy birthday to my amazing son. No. Tell Leo I'm proud of him. Just business. Eleanor had stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She typed and deleted 3 different replies before sending nothing at all. There was no argument left to have. Julian had made his priorities clear. She clutched the phone, her breath shallow. She had promised Leo a perfect day, a day where he was the center of the universe. When Leo asked, "Is Dad coming home soon?" she manufactured a smile that felt like cracking glass. "Honey, your dad is closing a huge deal. He's a hero at his company." A half-truth. A flimsy shield for a boy who still saw his father as a giant. But the reality of it washed over Eleanor in painful waves. She remembered Leo leaving his favorite drawings on Julian's pillow, just in case he got home after bedtime. She remembered the way Leo would stand by the window, watching for his car, long after she knew he wasn't coming. Ilara brushed away the memory of Julian's promises, each one dissolving as quickly as foam on the lakefront. By the time she and Leo stepped into the grand hall of the Chicago Architectural Foundation, she had finally made a fragile peace with the fact that Julian was, once again, buried in work. She'd spent the afternoon crafting gentle excuses for Leo, bracing herself to absorb the weight of his dashed hopes. What she hadn't braced for was the savage irony fate had in store. She never imagined Julian would be here, at the very awards gala he claimed he was too busy to attend, with a different woman draped on his arm. She never imagined Leo would have a front-row seat to his father's betrayal. She never imagined the universe would take this one evening she had tried so hard to salvage and utterly demolish it, because missing a family promise was one kind of hurt. But showing up at a black tie event with his top client on the night Ilara was trying to shield their son from disappointment was a different beast entirely. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a work emergency. It was a calculated deception, executed with breathtaking precision. The kind of betrayal that doesn't just sting, it severs. For Ilara Vance, entering the gala felt like setting foot on a foreign world, one she had only seen in glossy magazines. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, champagne flutes chimed, and conversations buzzed under the soaring, vaulted ceilings. This was a universe of power suits and couture gowns, a place where people like her were not meant to be. But her mission tonight wasn't to blend in. It was to give Leo a glimpse into a world of wonder, a memory free from his father's absence. A greeter guided them toward the main exhibition space, past towering architectural models and influential city figures. Ilara was wearing a simple maternity dress she'd found on sale, held together by a prayer. But when she saw Leo's jaw drop at the sight of a scale model of the city's newest skyscraper, a radiant warmth spread through her. "Mom, it's like a city for giants," Leo breathed, his small hands pressed against the protective glass. Ilara managed a real smile. "Well then, tonight, you're the biggest giant here." She led him to the dessert table, a haven of familiar joy, in a sea of intimidating elegance. She got him a chocolate lava cake, something gooey and comforting. She didn't know if his palate was ready for prosciutto-wrapped figs, and she was determined to prevent even a single misstep from spoiling their night. A server refilled his sparkling cider in a champagne flute, addressing him as Sir. Leo puffed out his chest, beaming with pride. For one fleeting moment, everything was shimmering and perfect, a delicate, beautiful bubble. Alara allowed herself a deep breath. She scanned the room, absorbing details she never thought she'd witness firsthand. A famous developer laughing with a city official, a group of architects sketching ideas on a cocktail napkin. She didn't belong in this world of influence and ambition, but being here for Leo made her feel anchored to it anyway. Leo kicked his feet beneath a high-top table. "Mom, do you think Dad's buildings will be in a place like this one day?" Alara's heart clenched. She despised lying, but protecting him was a fiercer instinct. "I think he'd just want you to have fun seeing them," she answered, her voice soft. Leo nodded, satisfied with an answer only a child's pure heart could accept. The cake was a roaring success. Leo's delighted giggles echoed in their small corner, and Alara felt the tension in her shoulders finally release. Maybe, just maybe, they had salvaged the evening. But fragile things are made to be broken. And just as Leo took his last spoonful of chocolate, a local news crew's spotlight flared to life across the room, illuminating Julian Vance. The moment the camera lights hit him, Ilara felt a cold dread snake up her spine, a primal instinct that knew disaster was unfolding before her mind could process it. She looked over, expecting to see a presenter or the guest of honor. Instead, reality delivered its cruelest blow. Julian Vance stood there, the star of a life from which they had been completely erased. He wasn't tired, overworked, or hunched over blueprints as he'd described in his text message just hours ago. He looked powerful, charming, and utterly at ease under the bright lights. But it wasn't his presence that made Alara's world tilt. It was the woman beside him, Serena Croft, a real estate mogul so polished and formidable it was almost offensive. Her crimson dress clung to her like a second skin. Her smile was sharp and confident, and her hand was tucked possessively into the crook of an arm that Alara still considered hers. Julian's hand rested on the small of Serena's back, an act of casual intimacy that felt like a physical blow. In that instant, the rhythm of the room dissolved. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all faded into a dull roar inside Alara's head. Her thoughts raced, trying to build a plausible explanation. A last-minute client meeting, a professional obligation, a misunderstanding, but then Serena tilted her head back, laughing at something. Julian leaned in to whisper in her ear, his fingers tracing a line on her arm. No, this was no meeting. This was no accident. This was a betrayal, dressed in couture and paraded in public, right in the middle of her son's special night. Leo spotted him a second later. His little hand paused, the spoon hovering near his mouth. His grin vanished, replaced by a storm of confusion. "Mom, that's Dad," he said, his voice a tiny, wavering whisper. Alara couldn't breathe. Julian finally scanned the crowd, and the second his gaze locked with Alara's, his confident facade shattered. The charm vanished, his jaw went rigid, and his body tensed. It was the look of a man cornered by a truth he could no longer escape. Serena followed his line of sight, her smile faltering, as she saw Alara, then Leo, then the half-eaten slice of cake that served as a sad birthday substitute. A flash of something, surprise, annoyance, maybe even guilt, crossed her features. Alara rose to her feet, her hands feeling disconnected and cold. Leo grabbed her dress, his knuckles white, searching for an answer she didn't have. Across the hall, Julian took a single, faltering step backward. In that one, catastrophic moment, the carefully constructed world he built on secrets, collided with the family he had left behind. Elara didn't consciously decide to move. Her body reacted on instinct, driven by a fierce, maternal need to shield her son from the implosion happening right before his eyes. Across the crowded room, Julian went ramrod straight, as if struck by lightning. Serena Croft's hand fell from his arm, her expression shifting from confusion to visible irritation. Alara's voice was a raw whisper when she finally reached them, shaking not with weakness, but with the crushing weight of her discovery. "Julian, what is this?" He blinked rapidly, a tic he had when searching for a quick lie. "What are you doing here?" he shot back, his tone defensive and sharp. "Are you keeping tabs on me?" The sheer nerve of his question stole her breath. "You canceled on your son," she said, her voice cracking as she fought to keep it steady. "I brought Leo here because you claimed you were swamped at the office." Leo huddled behind her, his small hand clutching her dress. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling, "why are you with her?" Julian swallowed, his eyes darting around the room as if mapping out an escape route. Heads were starting to turn. The city's elite, architects, developers, all sensing the quiet spectacle unfolding in their polished world. Serena stepped forward, forcing a smile that was all ice. "Julian, perhaps we should go," she murmured, just loud enough for Elara to hear. The opulent air of the San Francisco Tech Gala suddenly felt suffocating. Eleanor's breath caught, but a cold resolve settled in her bones. "Please don't stop on my account," she said, her voice a polished, chilling whisper. "Clearly this is your moment." Sienna's professional smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Julian didn't mention you'd be joining us," she stated. Her words clipped, implying Eleanor was the one out of place. A bitter, humorless laugh almost escaped Eleanor's lips. "Your moment, your award, while I was waiting for you with the ultrasound results for our son." Julian, the celebrated tech mogul, dragged a hand down his face, his composure cracking. "Eleanor, this is not the time." "But it's the stage you set, isn't it?" she retorted, her voice trembling but unbroken. For the first time that night, Sienna's polished confidence vanished, leaving her looking utterly exposed. She took a half step away from Julian, as if the consequences of his choices were a fire she could suddenly feel. Elara felt Leo's small body trembling against her leg. In that moment, with architectural marvels surrounding them, a devastating betrayal beside her, and her son's world crumbling, a powerful clarity washed over Elara Vance. It wasn't anger or a desire for revenge. It was acceptance. This was the end of protecting Julian's secrets and the beginning of protecting her own future. Just as her legs began to feel unsteady, a calm presence moved from a nearby group. A distinguished-looking older man in a perfectly tailored suit approached them, his expression one of quiet authority and concern. Marcus Thorne. She hadn't spoken to him in months, not since he'd guest lectured at a design seminar she'd attended. He was a legend in Chicago's architectural scene, a mentor to dozens of young designers, including, once upon a time, Julian. She remembered his sharp intellect and his unexpectedly kind eyes. She never dreamed she'd see him here, let alone walking directly into the center of her life's demolition. "Elara," he said, his voice low and laced with genuine concern. "Is everything all right here?" Julian stiffened immediately, his face paling slightly. "Who are you?" Marcus ignored him completely. His gaze remained on Elara, then softened as he looked down at Leo, who was peeking out from behind his mother's dress. Elara opened her mouth, but only a choked sob came out. I don't know." Marcus moved to stand beside her, a subtle, grounding gesture of support. It wasn't intrusive or dramatic, but his mere presence felt like a shield. Julian scoffed. regaining a sliver of his arrogance. "This is a private conversation." Marcus finally turned his steady gaze on him. "You made it a public spectacle," he stated, his voice even, but carrying the weight of profound disappointment. "And your son is visibly upset." Isabella blinked, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She wasn't accustomed to being corrected in spaces she considered her own. "Listen, we aren't looking for a scene." "No one is," Dr. Thorne replied, his tone soft but unyielding. "But a child is in distress. That has to come first." Something shifted in Julian's expression, a mix of anger, humiliation, and perhaps a flicker of panic at how this was playing out in front of his biggest investors. Leo tugged on Olivia's dress. "Mommy, can we go home now?" His quiet plea was a knife to her heart. Marcus leaned in slightly. "If you need," he said, his voice low, "I can escort you both outside, just to create some space for you." Julian stepped between them, his anger flaring. "She doesn't require your assistance." Olivia drew a long, slow breath, the kind a person takes right before their world changes forever. For the first time all evening, she met Julian's gaze directly, her own steady and clear. "Actually, I do," she stated, "and so does our son." A silence spread through the surrounding crowd, because in that instant, Olivia was no longer standing there alone. Olivia couldn't recall the walk from the showroom floor to the main exit. She only remembered Leo's small hand clutching hers, vibrating with unspoken fear, and the solid, reassuring presence of Dr. Marcus Thorne walking a respectful pace behind them, near enough to be a shield, but far enough to grant her dignity. Outside, the sharp Chicago wind whipped off the lake, a cold dose of reality on her flushed cheeks. The city skyline glittered over the dark water, its reflection shimmering just like her own unsteady pulse. Leo sniffled, rubbing his eyes with the cuff of his tiny blazer. "Mommy, did I do a bad thing? Is that why Daddy didn't want us at his table?" The question was more painful than any of Julian's public slights. Olivia knelt, framing Leo's face with her hands. "No, my love. You did nothing wrong at all. None of this has anything to do with you." "But Daddy looked so angry," Leo whispered, and he kept touching that lady's back. Olivia's throat felt like it was closing. She desperately wanted to shield him from this, to build a wall around his innocence that adult failures couldn't penetrate. But the truth had already crashed their party, dressed in couture. Before she could find the words, Marcus crouched down to their level, his voice calm. "Leo, sometimes grown-ups get so busy with their own plans that they forget what's most important. But that is never, ever your fault." Leo stared at him, taking in the words with the solemn gravity of a child trying to understand a deep hurt for the first time. Olivia looked at Marcus, truly saw him, poised, compassionate, and decent. He had walked into their personal firestorm without a moment's thought, driven not by ego, but by pure instinct. He couldn't know the history, but he understood the human cost perfectly. "Thank you," she breathed. "You don't have to thank me," he answered quietly. "You just shouldn't have to face something like this by yourself." Before Olivia could reply, the heavy glass doors of the venue swung open. Julian strode out, his face a mask of fury, his hands clenched at his sides. "Olivia, we are going to talk about this right now." Marcus straightened instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle bystander to immovable protector. "Now is not the time," he said, his voice firm. "Your son is overwhelmed. Let them go." Julian's furious gaze snapped to him. "You have no business in my family's affairs." Olivia finally got to her feet, her exhaustion hardening into a quiet, steely resolve. "You gave up that right first," she said, "long before this evening." Julian's mouth fell open, but nothing came out, not with his son watching him, not with Marcus standing there, like a calm barrier he couldn't intimidate. And for the first time, the real estate magnate Julian Vance looked uncertain of the power he had always taken for granted. The morning after the launch party felt unnaturally still, as if her whole world was waiting to shatter. Their penthouse, which usually echoed with Leo's laughter, was eerily silent. He sat drawing quietly at the marble island while Olivia packed his preschool backpack, her hands trembling so much she could barely zip it. She hadn't slept, not for a second. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Julian's hand on Isabella's waist, saw Leo's face crumple in confusion, and heard Julian's hissed accusations, as if she were the one who had committed a crime. After dropping Leo off, Olivia drove toward the grocery store until the low fuel light pinged. She pulled into a gas station and took out her debit card. Declined. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She ran it again. Declined. Panicked, she opened her mobile banking app, and the air left her lungs in a painful rush. Julian had wired almost every dollar from their joint account, leaving her with $1,427. The humiliation at the party had been emotional. This was a declaration of war. Her hands shaking, Olivia scrolled through the transaction history. That's when she saw them. A string of lavish charges, suites at the Peninsula, tasting menus at Chicago's finest restaurants, receipts from jewelers on Michigan Avenue, car services booked at 1 in the morning, all from the past 3 months, all funded with their shared money. Olivia sat in her car, the truth a suffocating weight. Julian wasn't just having an affair. He was financing an entirely separate life with the funds she believed were for their family, for Leo's education, for the baby on the way, for their future. As if to mock her, a notification appeared at the top of her phone. Your credit card payment is past due. But Olivia had never been late on a payment in her life. A wave of nausea hit her as she opened the account details. The statement was filled with purchases she had never made. Designer handbags, a couple's spa weekend, 2 first-class plane tickets. Julian hadn't just drained their liquid assets. He had secretly opened a high-limit credit card in her name. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a messy affair. It was a strategy, a cold, methodical plan to leave her utterly ruined, a plan she had been too blind with love to see. As she stared at the screen, one reality echoed in the sudden silence. Julian wasn't just unfaithful, he was constructing a new life without her, using her own financial security as the scaffolding, and Olivia Vance had just stumbled upon the blueprints of his betrayal. Olivia stood before the towering glass facade of Vance Development on Wacker Drive, clutching a manila folder filled with bank statements and credit card bills she'd printed before the sun came up. She wasn't sure what she hoped to achieve: an apology, an explanation, maybe even a sign of remorse. What she needed were answers, not for their marriage, but for her own survival. The lobby was a symphony of cold marble and steel. Men and women in impeccably tailored suits moved with a purpose that made her feel like a ghost, completely out of her depth. But she clutched the folder tighter and walked toward the elevators. By the time she stepped out onto the 17th floor, her heart was pounding against her ribs. Julian's executive assistant, a chic young woman, glanced up from her monitor. "Can I help you?" "No," Olivia said, her voice strained. "I'm his wife." A brief, uncomfortable look passed over the assistant's face. "Let me see if he's free." But Olivia didn't stop. She strode past the desk, pushed open the heavy oak door to his corner office, and stopped dead. Isabella Serrano was sitting on his lap. Not beside him, not in a chair across from him, but on his lap. Her arms were draped around his neck, her mouth close to his ear as she whispered something that made him break into a wide, easy grin. It was a grin Olivia hadn't seen directed at her in years. The sound that escaped her wasn't a scream or a sob. It was a quiet, wounded noise, the sound of a spirit breaking. Julian shot to his feet. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" Isabella slid off him with practiced ease, smoothing her dress with a self-satisfied smile that made Olivia's stomach clench. "You told me she was just being dramatic," Isabella murmured, folding her arms. Olivia's hands shook as she thrust the folder forward. "You emptied our accounts. You took out credit cards in my name. Julian, what is all this?" Julian's expression morphed from shock to annoyance to pure cold dismissal. "You have no business digging through my finances," he said sharply. "That's a complete invasion of my privacy." Olivia stared in disbelief. "Our joint savings? The credit card with my name on it? That's an invasion of my life." Julian stood, straightening his tie as if he were preparing for a shareholder meeting, not witnessing the implosion of his family. "Look, Olivia, I am moving things in a new direction, and I cannot have you causing these disruptions, especially not here." Isabella leaned against the desk, her lips curling into a smirk. "It's probably time to accept it, Olivia. Some partnerships just run their course." Olivia looked from the man who had promised her the world to the woman who was now living in it. Then Julian delivered the killing blow. "I want you out of the penthouse by the end of the week." The room tilted, because in that moment, Julian wasn't just ending their marriage. He was methodically erasing every trace of her from the life they had built together. Olivia Vance had no memory of leaving Julian's office building. One second she was watching the man who promised to love her forever treat her like a hostile takeover. And the next she was sitting in her car in the parking garage, the folder of evidence lying on the passenger seat like a tombstone. Her vision swam, her breathing hitched, and the sheer weight of it all, the financial devastation, the profound betrayal, the public shame, crashed down on her. She tried to take a breath, but it came out as a ragged, broken sob. Leo. The single thought was a lifeline in the storm. Her son, her baby, her reason to fight. Olivia leaned her forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel and finally let herself weep. It was a messy, raw, and desperate grief. The kind that rips through you when you realize the future you poured your soul into was stolen from you. By the time she arrived home, her face was puffy and her chest ached. She opened the door to their apartment to see Leo on the floor, constructing an elaborate tower out of blocks. His face broke into a brilliant smile. "Mommy, look! I made our building!" His sweet innocence was another crack in her already shattered heart. But she refused to fall apart in front of him. She swallowed the lump in her throat, knelt on the floor, and managed a smile that felt like it was tearing her face apart. "It's the most beautiful building I've ever seen, sweetie." That night, long after Leo had drifted to sleep, Olivia sat alone in the cavernous kitchen, surrounded by overdue notices, banking alerts, and the profound, suffocating silence Julian had left in his wake. She stared at the tablet screen, the digital confirmation a monument to his deceit. It wasn't just the affair, but the sheer, calculated audacity of it all. Then, a new message popped up on the synced screen. From him to her. "Aspen is all booked, my love. Our new life is about to begin." Alara's hand shot to her stomach, a protective instinct. Julian wasn't just cheating. He was replacing her, a swift, silent erasure. The man who had vowed to build a future with her was now constructing a new one on the ashes of their marriage. For a long, hollow moment, Alara just sat there, the city noise outside fading to a dull hum. Then, a foreign feeling flickered deep inside her. It was tiny, almost undetectable, but it was there. Not fury, not heartbreak. It was a single defiant ember. A voice in her soul whispered, "You will not let him extinguish you. Not like this." It wasn't strength, not yet, but it was the seed of it. The next morning, Alara walked out of their high-rise condo, a chill clinging to her that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. Sleep had been a stranger. Every time she drifted off, She'd see images of mountain chalets and champagne toasts, Julian's icy voice echoing, "Our new life." She needed a plan. She needed air. As she waited for the elevator, a calm voice called her name. Alara. She turned, surprised to see Dr. Marcus Thorne, her OBGYN, holding a leather briefcase. He wasn't wearing his usual white coat, just a charcoal gray suit that made him seem less like a doctor and more like a concerned friend. What are you doing here?" she asked, painfully aware of the puffiness around her eyes. "I have another patient in the building," he explained gently. "But I saw your face. Last week's appointment felt tense. I was worried." Her breath hitched. No one had noticed her pain in so long. Alara tried to build a wall of politeness. "I'm fine, really." But Marcus's kind eyes saw right through it. His gaze fell to the tablet she was clutching like a shield, the screen still faintly glowing with the Aspen itinerary. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. Alara hesitated, then, on impulse, wordlessly handed it to him. Marcus scrolled through the details, his brow furrowing, his jaw tightening with each damning confirmation. When he looked up, his expression was grim. "Alara," he said, his voice low and serious. "What Julian has done here isn't just a betrayal. Moving marital assets like this for an affair. It's illegal." The word hung in the air, a shock to her system. Illegal. Not just monstrous, but criminal. "I can't afford a lawyer to fight Julian Thorne," she whispered, the words tasting like defeat. But Marcus shook his head. "That's not something you need to worry about. My sister is one of the best family law attorneys in the city. She specializes in this." Alara just stared at him. "Why would you do this for me?" Marcus met her gaze, his sincerity a balm on her shattered nerves. "Because what he did to you, especially now, is unforgivable. Because your child deserves a secure future. And because sometimes you get a chance to help someone right at the moment they need it most." For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the crushing weight on Alara's chest lightened, just a fraction. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. But this one wasn't born of grief. It was hope. A hand reaching down just as the floodwaters were rising. Marcus gave her back the tablet, his voice firm. "You're not in this alone anymore, Alara. And you're not losing. Not if my sister has anything to say about it." Alara Vance had spent 5 years making herself smaller to fit into the grand cold world Julian Thorne designed. But the day after Marcus offered his help, something fundamental shifted. It wasn't a sudden storm. It was the quiet, inexorable turning of the tide. It started with a simple act in the nursery, a room Julian had insisted be minimalist gray. Tucked away in a storage closet was a can of vibrant sunny yellow paint she'd bought for a personal art project, a color Julian had vetoed as tacky. Today she opened it. She put on a pair of old jeans, braided her dark hair out of her face, and began to paint a mural of a sprawling sun on the wall. Looking at her reflection in the window, she didn't see the woman who had cried over a tablet. She didn't see the wife waiting for a man who was building a new life. She saw the artist she used to be, a woman who was bruised but not broken. She skipped her usual morning walk and instead went straight to a downtown law office, the one Marcus had sent her to. Her hands trembled as she signed in at the front desk. Her voice cracked as she began to explain her story to the attorney, Catherine Thorne. But she pushed through, laying out the facts with a clarity that surprised even herself. By the end of the meeting, Catherine looked at her with a determined smile. "Don't you worry, Alara. We're going to take good care of you." Tears sprang to her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the staggering relief of having an advocate. The challenges, however, were just beginning. Julian started texting. "You're being hysterical. It's a work retreat. We need to discuss this like adults. But Alara didn't take the bait. Instead, she screenshotted every message and forwarded it to Catherine. By evening, she had compiled a mountain of financial documents, tax returns, bank statements, investment portfolios, even the deed to the condo Julian was planning to share with someone else. She scanned them, organized them, and labeled each file with a steady hand. That night, as she sat with her laptop, the warm glow of the screen illuminating her face, she felt a gentle kick from within. It was scary. It was bigger than anything she had ever faced. But it was motion. It was a path forward, and when she placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay," she wasn't just hoping. For the first time on this dark, painful road, she was starting to believe it. While Alara was quietly forging her armor, Julian Thorne's gilded empire began to show its cracks. Then, the fissures spread, with the terrifying speed of a man losing the absolute control he believed was his birthright. It began at his firm. The morning after Alara discovered his plans, Julian strode into the Thorne development offices, expecting the usual deference, the quiet awe, the frictionless power his name afforded him. But the atmosphere was wrong. His assistant seemed terrified to look at him. Partners whispered behind closed doors, and a sleek, black envelope lay on his mahogany desk, marked private and confidential. It was a summons from the board. "We've received an anonymous tip regarding the misappropriation of corporate funds. A full forensic audit will commence immediately." Julian's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what they would find. The client gifts to Sienna's design firm. The trips to Milan filed as site research. The lavish dinners expensed as investor relations. He threw the letter onto his desk. "This is a witch hunt," he seethed. But the trap was already sprung. By midday, the managing partner met with him. "You need to be completely transparent, Julian. Things are looking very serious." They looked even worse when Sienna ignored all 4 of his calls. She had gone completely dark. The woman he'd promised a new life had evaporated the moment his current one started to implode. He texted her again. "Call me. Now." The message showed it was delivered, but no reply ever came. His fists clenched. He wasn't accustomed to being disobeyed. Meanwhile, Ilara's utter silence was a form of psychological torture. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't pleaded. She hadn't done anything he'd anticipated. She had simply vanished. Her quiet withdrawal scared him more than any fight ever could. Back at the condo, he called her phone, straight to voicemail. He stood in the living room he now hated, a vortex of fury and fear spinning inside him. He was losing his grip on every part of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. Then came the ultimate insult. His corporate Amex was declined when he tried to book a suite at the Peninsula, a desperate move to try and win Sienna back with luxury. He stared at the rejection email, pure rage coursing through him. This was not how his story was supposed to go. He was the one with the power. He was the one who made the rules. Instead, in the span of 1 week, Julian Thorne was getting a taste of the ruin he had authored, and Alara hadn't even had to raise her voice. Sienna Cole had no intention of ever speaking to Alara Vance. In fact, she'd spent the last 3 days purging all evidence of Julian from her life, deleting his number, blocking his profile, erasing the texts filled with hollow promises. Sienna saw herself as a survivor, not someone who got caught in the messy wreckage of other people's lives. But the reality was stark. Julian's world was a 5-alarm fire, and he was trying to use her as a human shield. So when Sienna appeared outside Alara's condo, she wasn't wearing her usual armor of designer confidence. She was wearing shame. Alara opened the door, her expression a mixture of shock and exhaustion, and saw the woman who had co-authored her nightmare, standing there. "What do you want, Sienna?" Ilara asked, her voice devoid of heat, which was somehow worse. Sienna swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm not here to apologize. I'm here because you need to know what you're really up against." The parts of the story Julian left out. Ilara remained silent, but she left the door open. Sienna took a shaky breath, the kind that precedes an ugly truth. "Julian told me your divorce was already finalized. He said you were emotionally unstable, that you'd cheated on him first, and that the baby wasn't his." Her gaze fell to the floor. I wanted to believe him. Ilara's hand instinctively tightened on the doorframe. Sienna pressed on, her voice trembling slightly. "He promised me the world, a partnership, a new beginning. But then I saw the cracks. The secret credit cards, the frantic calls about money. Then I found out he was taking loans from private lenders, the kind you don't mess with. He wasn't funding a new life." She finally met Ilara's eyes. He was trying to escape the debt from his old one. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs, but Sienna had one last bomb to drop. "He used your social security number to open several lines of credit. He practiced your signature. And that business trip to Zurich for his birthday?" She shook her head. "He was meeting a developer, a man who hinted at serious consequences if Julian didn't secure the next zoning approval." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. The deception wasn't just about us. It was about his business. It was fraud, woven into the blueprints. Deeper than I knew. "I walked away," Sienna said, her voice barely a whisper. "But he keeps calling. He thinks I'll help him salvage his reputation. He assumes I'll keep his secrets." She met Ilara's gaze with a raw honesty. "I am prepared to give a deposition for you. Whatever you require, I will state the facts." Ilara never anticipated an ally. She never anticipated the truth, but what she truly didn't expect were Sienna's final words as she stood to leave. "Julian Vance is about to lose his entire empire, and he knows you hold the key to his undoing." The conference room for the deposition felt intimate and suffocating. Ilara walked in, one hand on her rounding belly, the other clutching a portfolio her brother Leo had meticulously prepared. The recessed lighting overhead cast long shadows across the mahogany table. This wasn't a criminal trial. It wasn't a formal hearing, not at this stage, but it was the first binding step. Asset disclosure, restraining orders, and parental planning. Julian was already there, his posture rigid in a bespoke suit that likely cost more than her car. He refused to look at Ilara. His attorney, a notoriously aggressive man with silver hair, murmured something to him as they saw Ilara enter. But it wasn't Ilara's presence that made Julian flinch. It was her brother, Leo Martinez, a respected family law attorney, walking in behind her. He didn't take the seat beside her. He sat at the head of their side of the table, calm authority, an unshakable presence. It was enough to make Julian's jaw clench. The deposition began. Julian's lawyer described him as a visionary architect, a pillar of the community, suffering under the strain of a difficult pregnancy. Then Leo stood up. "Counsel, we have records showing Mr. Vance liquidated a joint investment portfolio, established a shell corporation in his wife's name without her knowledge, and funneled marital assets to fund a separate residence." A quiet tension filled the room. Julian's expression remained stony. Then came the moment no one anticipated. The door opened, and Sienna Croft was sworn in. The blood drained from Julian's face. She took her seat, her voice clear and steady. "I am here of my own accord. Julian misrepresented his marital status to me. He used funds from his business, funds I now know were commingled with marital assets, to lease a penthouse at the Elysian. He forged Ilara's signature on the incorporation documents for V Designs, LLC. A lawyer on Julian's team audibly gasped. Julian's lead counsel stared, utterly blindsided. Julian finally broke. Sienna, what in God's name are you doing? But Sienna looked directly at Alara. I am correcting a record. The arbitrator listened, making detailed notes. Mr. Vance, this testimony brings forward serious allegations of financial misconduct and ethical breaches. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It wasn't victory, it was air. The arbitrator then addressed her. Mrs. Vance, pending a forensic accounting of all assets, you will have exclusive use of the marital home. Mr. Vance's access to all joint accounts will be frozen. Julian leaped from his chair. This is a fabrication. She's colluding with her. But his voice was just noise because in that room, the truth finally weighed more than Julian's lies, and the demolition of his life had officially begun. Alara Vance didn't mark her victory with champagne. She marked it with a deep, shuddering inhale on the shore of Lake Michigan, the kind that fills lungs that have been constricted by anxiety for months. After the deposition, she picked up her daughter Lily from school and drove to North Avenue Beach. The skyline stood against a crisp autumn blue. Lily immediately began collecting stones at the water's edge, her gleeful shouts echoing in the open air, as if her small world finally had space to breathe again. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Alara felt grounded. She sat on a bench, watching her daughter, letting the calm of the waves soothe her. The immense pressure of the betrayal, the fear, the public humiliation began to recede with the tide. A familiar voice cut through her reverie. Thought you two might be here. She turned to see her brother Leo holding 2 steaming cups of tea. He must have known instinctively. You're a lifesaver, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I know, he said, with a small smile, handing her one. But I wanted to be sure. They sat in silence, watching Lily expertly skip a flat stone across the water. Leo grinned. She has your focus, he noted. She shouldn't need it for things like this, Alara whispered, the familiar ache surfacing. But for the first time, she wasn't weathering it alone. Alara, Leo said, his tone gentle, what you did today wasn't just about legal strategy. It was about you reclaiming your life. And Lily's, he added, that required immense strength. She looked out at the water, her eyes burning. I don't feel strong. That's when you are at your strongest, he murmured. The silence that followed was comforting, a blanket against the cold wind. Lily ran back, her face bright with excitement. Mommy, Uncle Leo, look at the perfect one I found. She held up a heart-shaped stone. Then, without a second thought, she slipped her free hand into Leo's, a gesture of pure, unconditional trust. Alara's heart swelled, not with pain, but with a feeling she had almost forgotten. Hope. As the sun began to dip below the skyscrapers, a profound truth settled over her. She wasn't salvaging a life from the wreckage. She was laying the foundation for a new one where she held the blueprints, one where her children were safe, one where loyalty stood with her after deceit had left. And for the first time since discovering the affair, Alara Vance could finally envision a future that didn't feel like a compromise. 6 months later, Chicago looked different to Alara Vance. The city hadn't changed, but her perspective had. The financial audit was a catastrophe for Julian. Sienna's testimony, corroborated by digital records and the fraudulent incorporation papers, gave the court a clear picture of his deceit. Julian lost his architect's license, his firm declared bankruptcy, and 2 of his major clients filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for fraud. For a man whose identity was built on his reputation and success, the collapse was absolute. The architectural journals wrote about his downfall. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. And in a stroke of final irony, the developer he'd been so desperate to appease was the first to sue, leaving Julian buried under a mountain of debt he could no longer leverage against Alara's assets. His empire was built on a faulty foundation, and he was now alone in the rubble. Meanwhile, Alara's life was quietly, beautifully being built. She had given birth to a healthy baby boy, Daniel. Her freelance design business was flourishing. Lily was happy, excelling in school, her drawings now filled with bright colors instead of shadows. But the most significant change was internal. One evening, Leo invited Alara to a fundraiser for the Chicago Architecture Center, an event she would have once dreaded. This time, she accepted without hesitation. She chose a dress in a deep emerald green that complemented her renewed confidence. When she walked in, Leo was waiting. He didn't offer platitudes or grand compliments. He just looked at her, his expression filled with a brother's pride. "You look happy, Alara," he said simply. "And I feel it," she replied, the words ringing with an unshakable truth. They spent the evening mingling, talking, laughing with a comfortable ease. Lily, staying with a sitter, had insisted Alara go and have fun. Later, while looking at a scale model of the city, Leo spoke, his tone shifting slightly. "You know, Alara, I never wanted to see you hurt. But I have never been more proud of the woman you've become. Alara, I know it's too soon to think about anything else, but you've built something incredible from the ashes. A family, a business, a future. Whatever comes next, you're ready for it." Alara felt tears well in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude, of catharsis, of knowing she had weathered the hurricane and found herself standing in the calm, clear aftermath. She squeezed her brother's hand. "I know," she whispered. Beside them, the city lights twinkled, and with that, Alara Vance stepped forward into her new life, grounded, whole, and finally completely her own. So our story reaches its conclusion. And if you have remained with me until these final reflections, it's likely because some part of this journey resonated deep within your own heart. Perhaps it echoed your own resilience, or perhaps it touched a scar you are still learning to understand. And that is perfectly fine, because life has a way of breaking us in places we never thought were fragile. But as the Stoics taught, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And Alara's story is a testament to that powerful truth. You do not require another person's validation to be complete. You validate yourself with every small, courageous choice you make. Healing is not always a dramatic crescendo. More often, it is the quiet melody of a new career, the steady hand of family, a child's unrestrained laughter, or the simple morning realization that hope has become louder than fear. So, if this narrative connected with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, not for the sake of an algorithm, but to help these messages of strength find their way to another soul who might need them today. And always remember, you are worthy of peace and deserving of a new beginning. This story is a work of fiction created purely for emotional reflection and entertainment. The characters, events, and situations, including names, locations, and behaviors, are entirely imagined and do not portray any real individuals or real-life incidents. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental. Our goal is to explore themes of healing, self-worth, and personal growth through storytelling, not to represent or criticize anyone in real life. We want our audience to know this story was created to uplift and offer solace, providing a sense of strength for anyone facing their own personal trials. Please engage with this story thoughtfully, remembering that it is a work of fiction designed for narrative purposes. Your presence here is deeply appreciated as we work together to cultivate a compassionate and secure environment for our community.